Is it playing? Yes. Perfect. In 3, 2.
I know we shouldn't have to scream that we're atheists. We don't have non-astrologers and all that. But with the religious people taking over the world, we can either speak up or be pushed into a corner.
I'm proud to be an atheist, a skeptic, a non-believer, an infidel, a heathen. I call it how I see it. I say it's ignorance and you just call it faith and unsubstantiated claims. That's something to be ashamed. I'm an atheist.
Coming at you live from Vancouver, BC and Washington State. This is Left of the Valley 2.0. My name is Kevin, and I like to borrow money from pessimistic people because they really don't expect it back.
Good idea. I thought of that.
Yes, I know, right? Joining me is the lovely Christine. Hi, Christine. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Well, still alive, can't complain. Even if I did, who would listen?
I'd probably listen for a minute or two, or pretend to anyway.
Appreciate it. And today we're going to have a very interesting show because we're going to talk to a story we've been following for quite a while, and I really feel that's a story we should not let go. Is about more about the residential schools. I should say the residential school scandal, Canada's shame, and I really feel it's a story we should not let go. So, with us we have Pixie Wells. Hi, Pixie. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm glad to be here today to speak on this very important matter. And you're absolutely right. We need to make sure that we are keeping this story at the forefront, and people are hearing the message from our survivors and our nation. So thank you for having me today. I just want to acknowledge, before we get moving, I want to acknowledge the traditional unceded territories that I'm coming to you from. I'm coming to you from the land of Sumac and Mathakwe people, and also the chosen home of the Fraser Valley Métis Association. I am the interim president for the Fraser Valley Métis Association. I am also the two-spirited LGBTQI rep for the Fraser Valley Métis Association, and I do consult with other organizations across our nation, across Canada, on two-spirited LGBTQIA plus issues.
Tell me you don't all have all that in your business card, right?
Not quite. We're getting there. And I just want to
you have to unroll a scroll.
I also just want to acknowledge, Kevin, that in case any of this stirs up any feelings for anybody who may be listening or whatever, please reach out to the Indigenous Residential School Survivors and Families Hotline, and the number is 1-800-721 in Canada 0066. So if anybody is disturbed by any of the conversation that we have here today, please do not hesitate to reach out and speak to somebody or an elder. Hi, Nate.
Let's do this. Let's do this. The hotline.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we do that scroll?
What's the number?
It's 1-800-721-0066. And you can also find it on the First Nations Health Authority website as well. I know the Métis Nation has one as well, so Métis Nation BC has one as well.
800-721-0066, right?
Correct. 1-800-721-0066.
That's in Canada, you said?
Yes.
Is there a U.S. one as well?
I'm not sure that. I was just looking in Canada because that's where I reside. So that's
yeah. I live in Canada.
I'm sure that there is. So
this is going to be interesting because I think a lot of times this is a big story that's been happening in Canada. It's a story that has yet to take flight in the U.S. because the U.S. has their version of this, and I hope it does happen down the road as well. So let's keep that story alive because I really think the First Nations have had such a raw deal for such a long time. So I really think it's time for us to correct the issue and correct the matter. So I just want to, Pixie, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate you being with us, of course. And for those people that might not know, here's some very quick facts on residential schools. Did you, especially because we have some American listeners, residential schools were essentially established for, how do I put this gently, erasing the culture from the First Nations, essentially trying to transform them into white Europeans.
Yeah.
Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their homes by the RCMP at the time, which is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It's estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families. 90 to 100% suffered severe physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. 90 to 100%. This is not the case here and there like you see like everywhere else. Now, 90 to 100%, that's a lot. and there was a 40 to 60% mortality rate in Indian residential schools. That's outrageous. That's outrageous in any day, in any statistic whatsoever. It's absolutely outrageous. The residential schools date back to the 1870s, and over 130 residential schools were located across Canada, and the last school closed was recently as 1996. So this is not something that happened in the 1800s. And you think, oh, that's history that's past. No, it's
I
fair.
thought it was the 70s, so I didn't
No,
realize
no,
1996.
1996
Wow. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
2/3 of Canadians believe, and 4 in 10 strongly believe, that Canadians with no experience in Indian residential schools have a role to play in reconciliation between Indigenous people and all Canadians. And I agree. It should be more than 2/3, but 2/3 is still a good number. So, Pixie, let's talk about your story. You want to give us a quick background as to where you come from, how you were raised, and all that?
Well, unfortunately for me, I wasn't raised in my culture. I called myself the lost children. I wasn't the stolen children of the survivor and residential institution grabs or the 60s scoop. I'm a lost child. We didn't speak about it in my family. And it wasn't until I was about 40 years old when I started doing some research and digging and realized that I was actually Métis, and then trying to connect myself to that cultural piece was tough because it's really tough to connect sometimes and really figure out where you fit in and finding yourself and finding your place in that as well. And having a voice and being able to feel comfortable enough, because you don't feel like you're Indigenous enough or Métis enough, or because you came to it at so late in your life. It's really hard to catch up to those people who have lived it and have been in it for their whole life. So it's an interesting story, and this was part of residential institutions. I don't call them schools, I call them institutions, because that's exactly what they were. They were institutions to in a lighter sentence, in a lighter word, is to erase the Indian out of the child. And that was what they were meant to do. They were meant to actually eradicate our race, right? So really, that is the true story. And this is where we need to look at truth, reconciliation, justice, and healing. And these are the messages that we took forward to the Pope. First of all, we need the truth, and we need the records of all Indigenous children who went to school. The Métis story has kind of been missing for a long time, because a lot of Métis children did go to residential and day schools as well, institutions. So and went to Indigenous hospitals. There's a lot more to the story than just the schools, and I think those are the things that we need to bring out the truth. And I think it's not time for Indigenous people, but it is time for people to hear the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit stories of the residential schools and the truth. The truth hurts, and we know it. We've been carrying it for years, and through generational trauma has been passed down through generation to generation, like myself, the lost children who didn't get to know themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Or who they were, how they would have fit in a community if our communities were still as live and well as they were supposed to be. And you got to remember, the Indian Act played a huge part. So there's more to this story for me anyway, from the understanding of, yes, the Catholic churches and the diocese and certain holy sees and churches took part. However, the Commonwealth played a huge part in making these things happen as well. So I believe, for me, from my takeaway, from what I take away, this is not just a one person or a one organization journey. This is many organizations having to come and apologize. And I think the Commonwealth needs to do her part. And I think that they need to do their part and apologize for the atrocities as well. I think that the churches that all took part in the residential institutions need to release their records, and also need to take part in the truth, the justice, the healing, and also the government of Canada, and same with the Northwest Mounted Police, which are now called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. However, I think they all have a role to play in true truth and reconciliation and moving forward. And how do we do that in a good way?
Mm-hmm. I agree. There's something that really irks me about this. I mean, politicians have stepped forward, the government of Canada stepped forward, issued an apology, and the churches, of course, some churches did, and the Pope finally managed to apologize as well. We'll get into that a bit later. Well, something that kind of irks me about the history of it all is I get the impression that right now a lot of people are giving flack to the government, rightfully so, for the role in this debacle. But it's I get a feeling I'm not historians, but I get a feeling it's not like the government at the time were basically saying, "Oh yeah, just go ahead and beat up these kids," right? But the church did anyway. I mean, and this is what really irks me. This is why I think the church has a bigger share of the burden here to wear, because the church could have treated these children like normal children, and they didn't. It was almost sadistic, the way they were treating these kids, and the government is to blame for looking the other way for sure. But I don't think that do First Nation feel that there was complicity, like 100% between government and the church when it comes to these kids?
From my understanding and the way that I see it, absolutely. The Commonwealth was our Commonwealth, and the Roman Empire. When you look at it, and they took us to the Vatican, and they took us around some churches. And when you look around Rome, and you look around and you see these great huge statues of the Roman Empire. I mean, when you look at it from a perspective of from an Indigenous person, really all it showed me is that there was more consensual about who's right and who's wrong, and who's the leader and who's not. And even in some of the paintings that maybe world famous, when I look at them, that's what I got. There was definitely an emperor or somebody of greater higher power than somebody else, that they made somebody else feel inferior to that. And who is the Romans, who was the emperor. And I believed, and I this is again my own feelings, and I believe that the Commonwealth needs to do their part as well. There's only been two queens in existence in the last 150 years. And an apology is one thing. It's easy to say I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But where's the action behind the sorry? As you said, Kevin, there's been many churches that have apologized.
Mm-hmm.
But what have they done as far as true truth and reconciliation? Have they opened healing centers? Have they allowed the Indigenous people to create their own healing centers and be? No, nobody's done that yet. So we're still missing a huge part of that cycle of allowing ourselves to be ourselves, but also have the engagement of the government, the churches, or the financial means to be able to do it in a way that is culturally appropriate for us, not culturally appropriate for somebody else.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, the worst part is they're missing a huge opportunity, because right now we do know there are some some reservations out there where some First Nation people are living in miserable conditions, and we're talking they don't even have clean water. So if you were a church and you're the Catholic Church and you're sitting on a ton of money, how good of a PR move is it to walk in there and put a new water system in there for those First Nations as a way to apologize? That's a huge PR move, and it would be amazing for them to do so. It'd be like two birds, one stone right there. You just made friends here. They won't even do that. It's to the point where they won't even open their own coffers. What they do is instead, as they're using some fundraising. So they're getting money from their parishioners because they won't even dig into their own coffers.
Well, see, and I've heard that, and I know that for a fact that there has been some fundraising to that extent. However, I think my journey over there was to listen to the Pope, to take in the experience of our survivors and give voice for the lost children and also the two-spirited ones. We had our own governance systems and stuff long before colonialization, and we need to get back to some of those practices. And within that money that you talk about comes that health piece. And I think that the church needs to open, and I don't know much if it's, though they definitely need to open their wallet. However, I think it needs to be done in a very informed way, in the sense that it's Indigenous led by the delegation or by chosen delegates of each nation, to make sure that we're following through on the truth, the reconciliation, the justice, and the health piece. The health piece is going to be the hugest part, is creating that trust, and also creating that feeling of belonging that has been taken away, and those practices that we now are just starting to get back to. However, again, it's our turn, I think, and we need to do some work legwork for ourselves as well over here, coming back to Canada, and not knocking on the doors, but saying, hey, listen, this is your time to work with us and walk with us in our communities. I live in Abbotsford, and BC, and when I look around the city of Abbotsford, I've been here most of my life, and I look around the city of Abbotsford, and we have pretty much a church on every corner. We have huge mosques, Sikh temples, and I have nothing against any of those things. However, we do not have one Indigenous cultural center in our city. Wow. Now, there's something wrong with that when we look around the country where, and, again, if we look at the Indian Act, which was made by, and it wasn't made by the church. So who brought in the Indian Act? Our Commonwealth brought in the Indian Act. So when we look at the Indian Act and we look back at some of the stories and the atrocities in the Indian Act, you couldn't have friendship centers within, I think it was 100 miles of each other. So that's why they're so far spread out. And we can't open a friendship center in Abbotsford because there's one in Mission. We can't call it a friendship center. So these are atrocities that are still happening. As you look at the pins I'm wearing, like we're still talking about our stolen and they call it unnamed graves or unmarked graves. That's not an unmarked grave site. That is murder in its finest and hidden for long time. And as I wear the other pin about violence against women, because it's still happening to our people. The atrocities are still happening. They're just not right out in the forefront like they were as far as residential school. We talk about Red Dress Day. Why is there so many murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit LGBTQI people going missing? Even our men. And who's doing anything about it? It's the only people that are talking about are the Indigenous people. And why are we still set at a lower standard than anybody else? And that seems to be how the society looks at it. And I think there needs to be change in that society. And I think it's up to Indigenous people to educate, but also take back our power. We're not less than anybody. We need to be equal partners in all of the discussions. And we need to be equal partners moving forward.
Here for sure. And it's even worse than just murder, because it's murder and it's neglect and it's being erased from history. I mean, I can't even think of something worse than that. Just being forgotten and erased purposely. It's disgusting.
Women being sterilized against their will.
Yes, absolutely. And these were and this was part of the erasing of the Indigenous people. So there's lots of atrocities that went on and took place that people still to this day are not talking about. And these are the things when we talk about true truth, we need to get to the true truth. And we need to hear the truth. And the truth does hurt. And it is going to hurt probably many people who belong to certain organizations or Catholic or Protestant or whoever, these people, but they need to hear the truth of what their faith brought to our communities. And we're still living that truth because through intergenerational trauma, a lot of us still feel it. And I know they say, somebody will say, well, how can you feel something from your ancestors? It's not that I feel it. It's what it caused my family to do was hide. So what did that do to me? That erased a part of me that now I'm trying to find.
Yes, absolutely. I think I call it the unseen Holocaust, because everybody talks about 6 million Jews, the Holocaust, but First Nations as people suffered way worse than 6 million. And nobody talks about it. They've suffered way more than 6 million people lost over time like this. I know the Jews, it was like in a brief moment in time, but still. It's
well, hey, I don't want to trivialize the Holocaust.
No, of course not.
But I believe the words we used was cultural genocide. When
absolutely, and it still goes on today.
That's a fair way to phrase it. And
it's still going on today, and that's the problem.
Yeah,
we're still not treated as equals. And from my experience and my understanding, the Indian Act needs to go for First Nations to be able to, take title of their own land. Like, yes, they were given these spaces to create homes, but when you've got 300 or 400 people that belong to a First Nations group of individuals, let's just say I'm going to use some math, and I think there's 400 of them out there on that land reserve. But there's only 50 or 60 houses. How is that even, how does that mathematically make sense? And, and it's not to take anything away from them because they're trying their hardest, because how do you house your people? And that's the only space you got. You got to do what you got to do. So we have people still living on top of each other in community. Sometimes you'll have, a lot of people living in one house. And you're right, Kevin, the water is another thing. Like, how simple is that? We can take water to other countries. We can fundraise for other countries. We can do all of these things. Even the Pope, we can go over and wave hands and do all these things for other countries. So far, nobody's done anything for the First Nations and the Inuit and the Métis to make sure that they're actually living at par with the rest of society.
I mean, as Canadians, we're known for bringing clean water to the world. I mean, even our military, the DART team in the military, that's what they do. They come in with water purification things, and we can't even do this in our own backyard. What the hell's going on here? This is just not right.
No, it's not right, and we need more people like you and Christina to bring those points forward, that it's not right. And and as nation to nation to nation, we need to stand shoulder to shoulder to shoulder, and we need to stay united, because united we stand. United, if we divide, we'll probably fall, and we won't get the things that we need and require to move forward as nations and to heal our people. It's going to take many years. Indigenous people look 7 years back and 7 years forward. So we still got, for me, 7 years forward is a long ways away yet. And and at this point right now, we're still at baby steps.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think back when I was a kid, I remember going to school with high school with a young lady whose aunt had been sterilized. So we know this shit, we've known it for a long time, and people just, like you say, they just don't talk about it, and it needs to be talked about more.
Just like we were saying a few minutes ago, that people think, oh yeah, this happened in the 1800s. No. This is very recent.
Then look at Ireland too. Same shit's going on in Ireland.
Right. And it's not that old. Like, people think, and you're absolutely right, Kevin. People think that this happened way back, why don't they get over it? It's still being done to this day, even though we don't have the 60 scoop in that term of the 60 scoop. Now we have the millennial scoop. So children are still being taken away. Birth alerts are still out there. So when Indigenous people go to have babies, there is an alert that says, hey, this is an Indigenous person. Come and check out, make sure she can be a good mother, or they can be good family members. Like, this stuff is still happening today in society. And, and these people, there's one or two of them that may speak out. Some of them aren't brave enough to speak out because they're afraid of the consequences of, what may happen to them, in a hospital, or some of them are afraid to even, acknowledge that they are Indigenous because of any nation, because they're afraid of what the treatment they may get.
That's absolutely outrageous to think that, I'm just trying to put myself in those shoes there. That, imagine the day my daughter is born, I'm at the hospital, all of a sudden somebody from the government comes in, we just want to check to make sure you'll be a parent or something. I was like, what the hell? Get the hell out of here. What the hell are you doing here?
Well, they actually do a home visit if it's your first child. A couple, 3 days.
Really? I've never seen that. Really?
Yeah, this is not quite like this is not quite.
Yeah. This is more supportive,
more suppression, and more making sure that as a first, I haven't had children, so as a person who, as an auntie, and seeing my first nephew being born, nobody came into that room to make sure that those parents were prepared and had a crib at home and had things at home in place and had everything in their cupboards. Nobody came in there.
Yeah. No, it was more like, how are you doing? Are you going crazy or not?
How to breastfeed, those kind of things, right? More of a supportive role.
Yeah.
However, when Indigenous people, and not all, but, and it's still happening today, when Indigenous women give birth, there is still birth alerts, and there's still children being taken. And we're trying to control them.
What is exactly? Can you elaborate on what a birth alert is?
A birth alert is when an Indigenous woman goes into a hospital to give birth to a child or children. The government is automatically, or the government in that age, the government agency in that area is automatically informed that this Indigenous person is in there having a child, and they go in to make sure that the right steps are, and if they don't have everything in place and whatever, those children can be taken just like that. Because
And this only
under the
happens
Indian
to
Act, they're still really governed by the government. They're still controlled by.
and this only happens to First Nation women, right? This doesn't happen.
Correct.
This is outrageous. This is absolutely outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these are things that are still happening. Like, these are atrocities that are still happening. And education, like, St. Clair said back in the day, Chief St. Clair said, education got us into this. Education should get us out. And we need to educate people on the truths. And it's going to be hard because our survivors are getting older as well. So we need to get those stories out there, and we need people to hear those truths. And my personal belief is that we need to go back to the churches and not take our people back to the church, take our people back to the church to educate the church on the atrocities that the church caused onto some other human being. And they need to hear that. And I think the youth will lead the way if we allow them to.
I think it's a great way. So let's speaking of the church, let's do a segue into that. How did First Nations come together and decide on something? To me, it seems obvious that the Pope wasn't going to make a move. So First Nations says, well, he's not going to make a move. We are going to make that move. So how did it all start? Did you guys decide, let's go to the Vatican, let's go talk?
From my understanding and from my recollection of how this all got together and how this all started, there's been a lot of talks with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops across the nation, with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. We do know that there is Métis people that are heavily involved in the Catholic Church, and that and some First Nations as well. Again, the Indian Act. If you weren't Catholic, you couldn't own land. So what happened, right? So people became Catholic so they could own land or become a real citizen of the country. So those things, I think those things are part of it, but I think it's the truth and reconciliation part that the nations decided, okay, enough is enough. We need to get on this, and we need to fix it. And with the finding of the children in Kamloops, that was just the breaking of the egg, right? Now we're finding more and more, and hopefully down in the United States, they'll start doing the same thing. And, I think if our nation, all from Canada and the United States, all stand together, united, I think we can make a very big presence and a very big voice. And we need our voices back at the table, and we need our voices at the table. They need to make the table bigger, and we need to be at the table to discuss our own moves forward and our own rights forward. As far as getting together with the church, I think it was, the calling of the Creator also, who put this sort of into place. And like I said, a lot of work with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. I do give them some credit for reaching out and seeing how they can help us lead our way into truth and reconciliation and justice and health. So I think there is some leadership on their part. And I did, in Rome, the Pope did give them some barking orders or marching orders, if you want to call it that, in things that they need to do out here to prepare for the Pope to come here to Canada in July. And they're talking about, people are talking about, it's going to be here, it's going to be there. I don't believe there's any really set specific spots yet. I don't think from my understanding, I don't think any of the delegates have made a specific decision, our leaders in our delegations, of where he will go. We just want to make sure that when he does come to Canada, that our survivors have the choice or the right to go and be held in a good way, but also looked after in a good way. We know that, society in itself, when they hear the Pope is coming, every Catholic person in the country is going to try to rent a room and go to where this place is going to be and take part in something that really should be for the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And this is what he's coming here for. And I think that's another thing that needs to be pushed and sort of emphasized, is that it's not that we don't want you to come and see Your Holiness if that's who you feel is Your Holiness. I just feel that this is not a time for that. This is a time for an apology to survivors who really want to hear it on Canadian soil, and a
Yeah.
time for the Pope to give that apology in a good way. And how do we move forward from here? Because I do know, like, a lot of people have talked to about, I hearing on the radios, oh, they took him gifts and they took him this and they took him that. Those were not gifts. Those were leave
They
behind.
had symbolic meaning.
And everything was said in, for the Métis Nation anyway, in our delegation, everything was specific to why we took it. There was a reason why, and it was each piece was a little jar more to, hey, don't forget. Hey, don't forget. Because we've
Yeah.
been the forgotten people for so long. But don't forget, we're here and we will come back. It's a trip to Rome, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Moccasins had particular significance. The red moccasins, if I'm not mistaken. right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
The fellow who designed those with purpose, and
Mhm.
that is Mitch Casey. He's from Saint Sue Marie, and he designed those. He's a amazing Métis beater from across our nation, and he designed those with each bead was representative of some walk forward and the way that we're going to walk forward. And hopefully the Pope, and he read up about the Pope a little bit, that the Pope wears red shoes. I had no idea.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
that's
Yeah.
where the significance of the red
Yeah.
came in. And also for us, for Indigenous people, and I looked at it as a symbolic, as well as that not just the Pope wears red shoes, is that our ancestors, and we believe that our ancestors' spirits can only see the color red. So
Oh.
I felt that he chose that color for another reason as well. So the ancestors that were behind us, who are pushing us and propelling us forward, can walk with us in that walk and see that walk. So that's what I hold also from the meaning of the red slippers. And Mitch Casey has much more meaning to it than that.
Yeah, because like I read there was another interview with you and you had said something about we walk together.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And I really love that. Yeah.
Well, and
And the
that's the
gift
only
of
way,
yeah.
and that's the
Yeah.
only way that we can do it. We have to walk together now. We have to do it, and hopefully our youth are becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. And hopefully that our youth will bring us out of this. I believe so.
Hopefully.
Um,
Yeah.
And I know from an Indigenous perspective, First Nations, Métis, or Inuit perspective, but I'm speaking on a Métis perspective, our youth are strong and fierce, and they want reconciliation and they want truth, right? We can't have reconciliation without the truth. The truth has to come first.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
it's going to be hard and people are going to bleed and people are going to cry, but we're still crying. We're still hurting. Our nations are still hurting.
Yeah, and people really need to get over this horrible image that a lot of First Nation people suffer from. For example, you might not know, but in Ontario, around the Simcoe area, there was a cartoon that was published by a local newspaper when the Pope apologized, and he basically said, "I'm sorry" in the cartoon, and there was a First Nation woman and man in the cartoon that said, "How sorry?" and sorry spelled with a dollar sign. Right, the S like a dollar sign. It's like, you got to be kidding me. You got to be fucking kidding me. Oh, sorry. You got to be freaking kidding me here. I mean, these people have suffered for so many years, and you guys are just looking at this as like an opportunity to just get.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the Catholic Church having the dollar sign.
No,
Because that's we're sorry, give us your money.
See,
Right.
and this
Cartoon
is
is
what
implying.
everybody believes, that we want money.
Yeah.
It's not money we want. We need to take control of our own nations, and we need to be able, yes, financially, yes, we're going to need some help to be, held at par and at equity with the rest of the nations. However, we also need to be having recovery centers for our own people. We need cultural centers so that we can bring people back to their culture. The ones who choose to come back, some may not, some may be okay with where they're at, and that's fine too. But we need to have the option. We need to be able to have that. And the church, I believe, from my understanding and the way that I feel about it, I believe the church can help in that way. The Holy See has a ton of money. And it's not that we want money and, they say, oh, well, write for this and you can get $40,000. $40,000 doesn't erase it. $40,000 doesn't bring back your culture. $40,000 doesn't bring back
Clean water.
clean water.
Yeah.
$40,000 doesn't bring back a lot of the atrocities and the things that have happened throughout the years, and the way that people feel about Indigenous people. You know, a lot of people still feel that Indigenous people are below them. And I believe in my own heart of hearts, that is why we still have murdered missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA+. And if you look at our men even going missing at an alarming rate now as well. Why is that? Is because people feel that we're a less than person than because that's what society's taught them.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask you what you think about Americans, like America and how they're, I would have to say they're pretty much ignoring, you know?
Well,
I don't know. Like, are you connected to American groups as well?
I try as much as possible to learn as much as possible because some of my roots do come from long before they put the border in.
Oh, yeah, of course.
My family was in Montana, North Dakota, Lewistown, came
Mm-hmm.
from
Okay.
a settlement in that part of Turtle Island there. So my family came from there. And yes, I try as much as possible. However, I think that government's a little more stubborn. And but I
Putting it mildly.
um,
Well, why does the media? I mean, the media will talk about all kinds of ridiculous crap, but they do not bring attention to,
nobody wants to be held to their faults, and this is the problem I think with government and with the Catholic Church. Nobody wants to stand up and say, hey, we made a mistake. And I think that's
yeah,
until that happens. An apology is one thing. Like I said, it's easy to apologize. I could sit here and swear and say, oh, sorry, Kevin, but then I could turn around and do it again, right?
Mhm.
So it's
yeah,
easy to apologize. Those words are easy to come out of your mouth. What is the action that you're putting with those words that are going to make those words solidified in somebody to understand that, hey, maybe we are taking the right step, or maybe we are making the right step. Yes, we don't expect this to happen in, I don't expect this to happen in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or when the Pope comes to Canada in July and, oh, all things are fixed. We know that's
yeah.
going to happen.
But it would be a good start.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'd like to, like I
Well,
said,
frankly, it's the expectation.
well, it is the
Yeah.
expectation when he comes to
Yeah.
Canada that he apologizes here on soil. What he
Are you
brings,
confident he'll do that?
absolutely,
Okay.
I am
Good.
confident
Good.
in that.
Good.
I believe the message that he gave us in Rome will fulfill that. However, I want to make sure that, for me anyway, that when he comes to Canada to give the apology, it's an apology on behalf of the Holy See, not the perpetrators who committed the crime.
Oh, of
There
course
is a
not. Yeah.
difference.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
difference in the apology.
Hmm.
It's one thing to apologize about people who made those mistakes, and yes, we're sorry that that happened. However, it's still the governance part of who ran the church. And unfortunately, he is the leader right now, so it's his job to step up and apologize on behalf of the Holy See.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And-
And not cover shit up.
yeah.
Like, yeah.
No, and this is where we're at, and we're hoping with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and with the First Nations delegations leaders and the Métis Nation delegation leader, Cassidy Caron, and also with the Inuit delegation leaders, that we can come to a really good place in keeping our message. This is it. It's truth, justice, health, and healing, right? And reconciliation, because they
Yeah.
have to come in that form. Reconciliation really is the last step, really, I think, in
Mhm.
the move forward, because that's the part where we take the actions and we reconcile. We haven't got to reconciling yet. We're still at the truth part. We've just
I was gonna
cracked the
say,
egg. There's no yolk coming out of that egg yet. It's just cracked open,
Yeah.
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Like I said, if I heard stories when I was a kid from my, peers or whatever about, we knew,
Yeah.
yeah,
Pixie, magic moment here for a second. Magic one. I'm just going to give you a magic one here. Let's put you in charge here for the next couple of weeks when the Pope arrives. Where would you take him?
Where would I take him? Oh, wow, that's a tough
I
question.
mean, aside the guillotine. What do you
Wow.
think?
Let's just say, where would I take him? I would
Which weed shop would you take him to?
Well, you know what? We can't walk forward together if we're both, trying to destroy each other. So, in that aspect, take him to, I would probably take him to Ottawa, and have him stand there with the government, and hopefully the two of them can apologize together.
Oh, nice. Love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that aspect, because we do know that there's a lot of Indigenous people there, and I do know that, you know, there's a lot of Indigenous people within Winnipeg and Manitoba. I think they're one of the largest populations of Indigenous people across Canada.
Okay.
From that aspect, and you know, as much as I'm a BCer, I would like to see him come to BC, but whether he does that or not, I think he needs to come to 4 places, because I think he does need to come to the place where they found the first children.
Yes.
I
Yes.
think he does need to come there, and he does need to make an apology there, and talk about what his walk is forward. Maybe that's his first stop, and then moving on into Alberta, because there's a lot of residential schools, and a lot of our survivors were from Alberta that were willing to come and give voice. So I think it's important that they get to be held to that, to be able to held up a little bit and saying, hey, you know what, we walked that walk and we gave our stories and we talked about it. So, you know, and as hard as that may have been, being with some of those elders and watching them tell their stories, and some of them are very horrific stories,
Yeah.
you know, about abuse and not being fed, and just the stories that come from all of them, you know, and the same stories, different nations. And we need to make sure that we stand strong with our message. Our message is the same across the board. And as Chief Kelly had said in a night we were all breaking bread together and eating together, that moving forward, the 3 brands of the sweetgrass are the First Nations of the Métis and the Inuit. And when you look at the sweetgrass, and it's 21, each one has 7 strands, and there's, you know, and when we look at it from, you know, 7 generations back, 7 generations ahead, you know, that's a strong statement coming from, you know, standing shoulder to shoulder, nation to nation. So I think, for me, I think it's very important that we stay united, we stand tall, and we keep talking. And as a leader and as a person who went, my job now is just started. And where can I go in my own communities and around the province of BC to speak to maybe some of the other Catholic bishops within BC, or some of the other Catholic churches to see, you know, where do they see themselves in helping the Pope make this apology, because they have a right to, they have an obligation, but they also have a right to, I believe, to have a piece and play a part if they choose to.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I know I don't have a say in this because I'm just a white Caucasian French guy, but my fantasy on this, I want to see the Pope kiss the ground where those children are buried. That's what I want to see.
Are there still displays of shoes and the like there? Is what that was one of my questions too.
Absolutely, and I think there will
Yeah.
be for some time to come,
Good.
until the Kamloops First Nations decide to, whether they decide to make a monument, do some kind of monument there or something, or whether they tear that school down, or what they choose to do with it. But I do believe he needs to go there. I really do believe that, and I think you may be right. You know, kissing the ground, but because it was one of the largest residential schools across Canada, it held one of the largest amount of children, from my understanding.
So far,
right? Yes, that we know of, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So that being said, I think it's an important place to start, and move his way out of the country to Ottawa, and hopefully by the time he gets there, maybe the Queen and the government and the RCMP will be standing there waiting for him, all to give their apologies in line as well.
If this was to happen, Pixie, you gotta let me know. If this was to happen, if you find out he's going to do that, I will take the day off and I will drive to Abbotsford, pick you up, Pixie, and we will drive the Kamloops, you and I, and we will see this. I want to see this. I want to see this happen.
If he goes to Kamloops, I definitely will be there. That is on my to-do list. Right. Making sure as a delegate that we make sure that he comes here in a good way and walks in a good way. So that's not taking too much on, but at the same time, I would like to see and make sure that our survivors have the opportunity to be wherever they need to be, with the help of whoever they need, and having support of a hotline or another elder or some sort of trauma informed counseling so that they can get their message across, and that he hears them, and that he also apologizes and says the things that they need him to hear.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Final little question, Pixie. I gotta ask you. Can you
I have a
describe?
couple.
Oh, okay, sure, that's fine.
No, after you. Yeah.
What was your experience like? What was it like to go to the Vatican? Can you run us through what is it like to go there to Rome, and is there a procedure? What was that experience like?
Well, that experience was definitely, I'm humbled and honored to be asked by my nation to go as a grassroots individual. And that's the voice that I took with me, was from the grassroots, the lost children, and also the Two-Spirit voice. So I was humbled and honored. The experience of going to the Vatican was very interesting in itself. We had, they still wear the old suits from back in the day, and it's kind of weird to see that. However, it was very quiet there. We were let in, and I got a picture of. Wasn't supposed to, but I did.
Nice.
I wasn't supposed to take pictures, but I did a what I call a mischievous picture. And what I did was, there was a spot where, when he speaks to people at the Vatican and he steps outside on that ledge or that window, I actually took a picture of that view from my camera from
Yes.
inside. And then I realized when I looked behind me what the big red chair was for. I wanted to sit in it, but I didn't. I didn't get that mischievous. But from my perspective, going to feel that bringing back some sort of a little token, I guess, for our survivors that were there, and that little piece of apology that he started with, I think was, and standing nation to nation to nation, was the hugest and most, that was the greatest part of the whole trip. Don't get me wrong, I saw a lot of nice things and saw, lots of beautiful views and everything, but that wasn't what we went there for. It wasn't a holiday, it was business. And we went there to be business-minded people and do what we needed to do for our nation and walk that walk. So for me, it was a prideful moment to be there, but it was also humbling to see the survivors feel like they were listened to. So, and I think that was huge. And to see the Pope actually give our fiddle players the thumbs up was pretty special, I have to say.
Nice. That's nice.
So I guess my questions are, what was your upbringing like? Were you raised religiously? And can you explain why it's unique to be Métis in Canada?
Well,
to be Métis.
Yeah,
I know the answer to that question, but I want you to elaborate, right?
Métis
Well,
not a
to
common
be-
term in the States.
To
right?
be Métis in Canada has been kind of a difficult situation for some of us because we are of European settlers and we are of First Nations. So we sometimes fall in that category of we're not quite white enough, but we're not quite Indigenous enough. And some First Nations, and it's not all, and and it's taken a long time to get to where we are. We have, we are under Section 35. We do fall under the Section 35 rights, and we are a part of, the three bearing nations of, there's three rights bearing nations in Canada.
Could you elaborate on, I don't mean to interrupt, but what is Section 35?
Section 35 is the rights for Indigenous people in Canada.
Okay.
So we fall under that category. However, we don't fall under the Indian Act, which is a little bit different for First Nations. So there's some differences there, and for some First Nations people, I think it might be a little bit hard for them to see that not all Métis people, some Métis people are Catholic and were raised in that Catholicism and believe in it, and still believe that Métis play two parts. We play two roles here. And I think that is maybe some of our voice here. And from my upbringing, my father is Métis. It comes from my father's side, where the Métis comes from. My grandfather was very strong in calling himself Norwegian, not anything else.
Oh,
From my
okay.
understanding, we're Korean Norwegian. From we came up from the bottom part of Montana into and
Okay.
settled into Red Deer somewhere. I'm still learning all of this stuff, but my upbringing wasn't Métis at all. My dad was a raging alcoholic, and
Wow.
whether that had anything to do with, like, somebody asked me, like, did your family go to residential school? I don't know. I couldn't answer
Mm,
that question honestly. I couldn't tell
wow.
you that. I can tell you from my father's my watching my father and his experience, there must have been some sort of trauma or something. And knowing that on my mother's side of my family, my uncle was a Catholic priest.
Oh, geez.
Oh.
So
Oh, oh dear.
how did my father meet my mother? Through the Catholic Church.
Wow. Okay.
Right. So I come from it's a very interesting, and not that I'm Catholic, I'm not Catholic in any stretch of the means, but I do know a lot about it. He was
Mm.
my uncle was ordained by the Pope. He many years ago. Yeah. So it's kind of complicated situation.
I have
However,
no doubt. That's why I'm,
I don't
you know,
take catechism.
yeah.
I don't. I very much follow the Creator and that spiritual guidance. My father did talk about it a lot as I was a kid. However, him being an alcoholic, his sisters, his family would always say he doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what he's
Mm.
talking about, right? So you kind of grow up wondering, okay, is he just an alcoholic talking out of turn, or is this truth?
Yeah, fair enough, I guess,
So
right?
I
Yeah.
grew up thinking, okay, well, I got dark skin and I could pass as an indigenous person. I wonder if I am. So most of my friends growing up were
Okay.
very much indigenous. I grew up in Abbotsford and hung out with a lot of indigenous people. However, at that time when you're young, you don't look at the culture and the history. You're just young and you're naive, and you just
You
you just
make friends.
hang out, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
now that's much more intense for me. I can say for the very first time I wore a ribbon skirt to the delegation, and I felt so much power in that I can't even explain it.
Can
Mm.
you describe I'm sorry, what did you call it?
The ribbon skirt.
Yes, ribbon skirt. Yeah.
Well, the ribbon skirt is an indigenous skirt that is worn by many indigenous women, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and it's a source of our matriarchal society and how it touches Mother Earth, and why it's so long, and that it connects us to Mother Earth as it touches the ground, because we are truly connected to
Okay.
Mother Earth through the trees, through uh, the great creator, right? We call her the great grandmother, right? And the grandfathers are the big rocks of Canada. So we truly believe that, water is life, and without the trees and without the fish, nobody's here. And, First Nations will, sometimes say, a lot of people will say, oh, give them back their land. But you'll hear some First Nations people tell you that we don't own the land. We're just stewardships of the land.
Thank you.
Nobody owns the land,
Yeah, that's, I think, a really nice way of putting it.
right? So
Yeah,
there is
yeah.
some First Nations people that will say, but there is other First Nations people and people that say, land was taken away from them, like even here in Sumac. There was a lake that was drained because they wanted to grow vegetables there, so they drained the lake and took a huge portion of Sumaque's land base away from them, where they would hunt and fish. So there's still those atrocities as well. However, I think we can move past some of those if we can reconnect ourselves to our own cultures in our own ways, by helping our people, as most of our people have become urban indigenized,
Hmm.
Yeah.
because we live in urban cities, right? And where do our kids go to school? Our kids leave the reservations or leave their land mass or their land base, and they go to the big cities, where they can find themselves sometimes usually in trouble with, just coming from you know a land-based reserve where communities around you, and heading to the big city like Winnipeg, and now not having any cultural
Mhm.
components or any ties or anything. Now you're trying to go to school. So there's a lot to be said there, and I think some of our own institutions, we need to make our own learning institutions, so that our nations feel comfortable to be themselves. And I think all institutions need to open that door to indigenization and indigenizing their platforms, and telling the truth of Canadian history, not the history
Yeah.
that we've portrayed ourselves to be. This, wonderful country. Yes, we're a wonderful country, but we have things in our closet that we need
Yeah,
to bring
absolutely.
out
Yeah.
and heal from, and we all need to heal from them. And I think, for me, I think the church needs to heal as well, and I
Hmm.
think they need to hear the truth, and I think their youth need to hear the truth. And so for me, like I said, I have a lot of work to do. This is just the start of it.
So let's quickly
So,
remind.
no religious upbringing, then.
And
Would,
then
would you say?
pardon me,
Would you say you did not have a religious upbringing, or
I did not have a religious upbringing. No.
okay, but you believe in a higher power?
I believe in the creator and a higher power. Absolutely. That was my focus from even when I was a kid. I always, I don't know, went to the river, went to the trees. So when I say that I'm a lost child, I'm a lost child in that sense, but something always took me to the forest or to the
Yeah.
river. There was some connection where I found peace there always. So
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
that's where I found it. Don't get me wrong, when we were forced to go to Sunday school when we were children, because that's
These
just
poor
what you were
things.
forced to do, right?
Okay.
You put on your
Yeah.
Sunday
Okay.
best and you go
Yeah.
to school, you go to Sunday school. Did I enjoy it? No, absolutely not. But that's what family did on Sundays.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody who enjoys church and, and Sunday mornings, and it's like, there's something wrong with that person.
Well, I think each to their own. And like I have a drum group that I go to every Saturday morning. That's my medicine. That's where I go to get my medicine for the week. It's a group of individuals, and we sing songs, and we share stories, and we share, the things that we share our circle. And those are the things that need to be brought back, because, Indigenous people sat in a circle for a reason. And it was so that, nobody sat at the head of the table. Right. And we can always make the circle bigger.
Yeah, exactly. So let's quickly remind people, our viewers. Okay, let's quickly remind our viewers, if you're triggered by you're a victim of the abuse from the church and all that, there's a hotline that's scrolling down the line there. It's 1-800-721-0066. And you also said there was somewhere you can contact, a website.
Yes, you can also contact Fraser Health, the First Nations Health Authority website, which is First Nations Health Authority, which is FNHA. And you can also find a crisis line on Métis Nation BC, which is Métis Nation British Columbia. And I'm sure you can find them across the country. I just want to make sure that we're, doing this in a good way and talking about this in a good way, that if anybody felt triggered by anything that was said, that they reach out and please speak to somebody.
Yes, that's very important. Pixie, one last question I got to ask. As a person who is not First Nations, I'm Caucasian, French, typical guy. What can we do to help with First Nations and the struggle they're going in? What can the ordinary citizen do to help?
I would say read the calls to action. Pick one, work on one for a month, or work with a community on one, or look at the calls to action. What are the calls to action for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit or in the surrounding area where you live?
Mm-hmm.
And pick one of those and be a voice. Be a voice out there that says, this was an atrocity. I think the more people that speak up, and people like yourself, Kevin, who help us with that, the calls to action will prove, and you'll see that these calls to actions, they're not mighty, they're not hard, they're just calls to action for justice.
Yeah, absolutely. Pixie, before I let you go, I gotta have you say, hi, this is Pixie Wells, and I took a left in the valley.
Pardon me.
I gotta have you say, hi, this is Pixie Wells, and I took a left in the valley.
Hi, I'm Pixie Wells, and I took a left of the valley.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pixie.
You are so welcome. And thanks for having me. And have a great day.
Awesome.
Merci. Big Witch.